I just spent 10 weeks saying the same thing over and over again. What am I supposed to do? I don't know change. I don't know how to adjust.
Hey YouTube, welcome back to our channel. My name is Elena.
And I'm Bjorn.
And we are Viking Age reenactors and living historians here to talk with you about your favorite Viking shows.
So we finally wrapped up with The Last Kingdom, which we just had put out our season finale video last week. If you haven't seen it, check it out now. And now, as we wait for the new season of Norsemen to come out, we are going to be doing an in-depth dive and examination of the amazing movie that is Valhalla Rising. It's a 2009 film starring Mads Mikkelsen, directed by Niklas Reiffen, who's the same dude who did the Punisher films as well as Bronson. It's a very unique take, I feel like, on the Norse as well as just filmography. Have you seen this before? Have we watched it?
Once.
Okay. Once before. Cool. I've seen it like 8 times, but that's fine. I haven't watched it recently. Been dying to. Or about to.
Because we've both seen it, this is probably going to be a little bit less of a reaction and more of just a in-depth discussion about the movie and the different scenes and what they contain. So I'm actually really excited to get into the discussion of that and really pick it apart.
So we just start off with this very Odinic figure who's being kept essentially as a slave in complete isolation. Like, there's no settlement near here. This is just the wilderness where they have this dude pitched up. And seemingly the only real purpose that he serves is to come out and fight and kill other men for money.
Right.
So that his masters can make coin off of him. He's an incredibly dangerous figure who is completely anonymous and a complete mystery. And I think it's really interesting that he doesn't make a single sound in this whole fight. Like, not when he's, alone with the boy who's, hesitantly, feeding him from a bowl on the opposite end of his cell as he's, locked in place. He doesn't make a sound when he's being painted and, held by the neck by his captives. He doesn't make a sound when he's getting untied and the dude yanks back on his, collar and, chokes him, or when he's being beaten. Not a single sound at all, and he just immediately goes from 0 to 100 aggression, and then back down as soon as the killing's over. He just goes right back down to his default and is ready to be put back in chains. It's terrifying, honestly.
It kind of is, yeah. One of the most basic things that you learn about Odin is that he was a war god.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that this mystery slave that is here to basically just kill for his masters, basically is kind of embodies that war god-like figure, mm-hmm. essentially. He's always going to win the fight. He's always going to get the coin for his master. Also, just the fact that he's kind of kept as this tattered slave, because that's kind of how Odin appears. Not as a slave, but when he appears on Earth, he's kind of in this tattered robe.
Yeah, absolutely.
He's a stranger that nobody really knows who he is specifically.
Yeah, and that's a very interesting kind of thing that comes into play in a lot of the mythology, is that he does come as basically a beggar in society.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't really explain his caste or anything like that specifically, but he definitely comes in on the lowest strata. And what's also very interesting is that despite that, he is a god of the kings. He is the king of kings. Mm-hmm. So he is somebody who is worshipped and honored and revered by the ruling class, and yet he chooses to come down and portray himself as a beggar, basically to kind of test people in that sense. He comes in as this poor, old, kind of almost wretched looking man, kind of just somebody who you'd easily just try to avoid, across the street when you see him, so you don't have to look at him or something. And he tests you, he quizzes you, and he kind of enraptures you in all these stories and stuff that he knows, and it kind of just binds you to himself in this mystery of how is it that this strange old beggar man knows so much and has so much experience and wisdom to him. I must know more. And that's exactly kind of what we're seeing, And the thing with Odin is that if you gained Odin's favor, it was said that you could not die in battle, mm-hmm. until he betrays you, because that's ultimately the fate of anybody who puts their faith in Odin, is that he grants you fame and glory and victory until he stops. Mm-hmm. Because ultimately, Odin's main goal in his mortal life, because he is a mortal deity, is to prolong the inevitable and delay Ragnarok as much as possible.
Right.
And the way that he does that is by trying to accumulate these prolific warriors, these amazing mortal soldiers, and gather them in his hall Asgard for the final battle, come Ragnarok, so that he's prepared and can, fight as best he can. And the only way to do that is by showing that you are worthy of his admiration and his recognition, basically. And the only way you can do that is by being an accomplished warrior. The reason I bring this up is because of, this whole gambling thing kind of associated with him. You can always place your money on Odin, and he will always win. Mm-hmm. Because he is the god of war. He is the god of death. There is nothing that can stop him.
Right. The other thing that I kind of want to say here, since we're still very early on in the story and we're watching our main character as a slave, is that Odin was himself once enslaved by a king. One that he actually helped when he was a child and then came back to and was betrayed and was strung up between these two fire pits. When the king asked him who he was, and Odin refused to tell him the truth, because he appeared as a beggar to him, essentially. So the king, not trusting him, basically imprisoned him, and he stayed there for 8 days and 8 nights. And it was either, by some accounts, as the king's brother, and by other accounts, as the king's son, who came to him and offered him a drink of ale. So the next day, Odin, being a god, finally had enough of it and broke himself out of the chains, told the king that he was going to die on his sword because he no longer had Odin's favor, and it came to pass. And he bid his brother or his son ascend to the throne after that.
He's never belonged to anyone for more than 5 years. Your time has passed.
There's clearly a history of him getting kind of passed around as a fighting slave, to different clans or different chieftains, as part of almost like a ritualistic practice.
These followers of the White Christ, they eat their own god. Abominable.
And, the dialogue starts to enforce that opening segment that we saw with some more of the religious strife as well. It opened up with, there was man in nature, and then man came with his crosses pushing out the heathens. Mm-hmm. And now we're starting to kind of get more of a sense of having one eye here to fight is all well and good. But, in the end, these people are being pushed from their homes, and they're being hunted, and they're hated, and they're in danger of getting themselves killed by these Christians who come, who, eat their own god and drink his blood like monsters. And they just want to, kill these people and push them from their lands. And the only thing that can keep them back is money. Before
any of these shows and movies started coming out, Viking was sort of synonymous with just barbarian. Mm-hmm. And that's all they really were. People are now finding out that, there's more to them. Obviously, Vikings themselves were the ones that raided and pillaged, so they were the barbarians, but there was more to their lives and their families and their communities back home than just raiding and pillaging, essentially.
Absolutely.
And because they were heathen, there was religious strife between them and Christianity, as Christians began to send out missionaries and sort of starting to push their religion mm-hmm. onto the other communities around them. There is a school of thought that believes that the attack on Lindisfarne was actually religious retaliation to what happened 11 years earlier at the Massacre of Verdun, mm-hmm. where 4,500 Saxons who were heathen at the time were forcibly baptized and then killed in front of their families for not being Christians, essentially.
Yep.
And word spreads of stuff like that happening. So some people do think that 11 years later, the burning of the monastery at Lindisfarne was the heathen answer to that.
Yeah, this movie, focusing on the the heathen side of things, has the same mindset with their aggressors, which at the time were the Christians. So it's we have this idea of the Dark Age of the Middle Ages being these Christian knights in shining armor, trouncing around, slaying dragons, and doing good for the people of the realm. Whereas they do have these very kind of strange behaviors and these strange practices themselves and beliefs. The Catholic idea that, taking the communion, the body of Christ and the blood of Christ, it, the wafer and the wine literally becomes his body and blood when you eat it. So it is this kind of barbaric notion of like cannibalism and vampirism that shows itself in Christianity, and that to them is seen as an atrocity because they're literally like murdering their god. So it does kind of show that that other flip side to the story that we often hear, where these good people are often there's more to it than that. It's that history is so often written and presented by the victor to paint themselves in a good light, but again there's a flip side to every story, and this is the opposite side of it. This is that barbaric, violent, evil nature that a lot of people viewed Christianity in at the time.
Yeah, and it goes back to both sides kind of not understanding each other, because on the flip side, the way that the Christianity tells it is, the things that they saw as barbaric. You hear stories about how, heathens would sacrifice animals and bathe in their blood, or ritualistic practices that they had. They didn't bathe in blood. But it's those ritualistic practices that the Christians see and kind of balk at. It scares them, essentially. But at the same time, like you bring up, they eat the body of their god. And to heathens, they didn't understand that. So, like, in any religion, in any community, you're going to have that. You're going to have those types of misunderstandings of people just not understanding exactly why things happen the way that they do.
So the other kind of big feature in this segment was One Eye's dreams. So throughout this, we'll see One Eye has these premonitions every once in a while that kind of like guide him or show him a glimpse of the future. It's a little bit of like this esoteric, magical thing that happens in the movie. But again, to build and construct more off of this idea of One Eye as this either representative of Odin or Odin himself. Odin was very well known to be a magic practitioner. He practiced seer magic and performed all these kind of rituals and often gave drastic sacrifices to gain knowledge of the future so that he could predict the outcomes and again try to delay Ragnarok as much as possible. And we kind of see this start to develop in this character again through these premonitions that he has, and it's painted in this stark blood red, which gives us a little bit of a glimpse into One Eye's mind as well. Everything kind of seems to be just painted in blood. It doesn't really tell him what's going to happen, but it shows him a glimpse of something that's important to focus on and to look for, and recognizing the pond that he was in and seeing him bathe in it. He takes advantage of that and remembers, and lo and behold, what does he find but a little arrowhead? It's not even on a sheath, it's just the bare arrowhead. But he takes it and takes advantage of it because he was guided there by something.
The thing that I wanted to also bring up regarding the loss of his eye, he gave up his eye to Mimir and put it in Mimir's well. There is a story that talks about that the other side of Mimir's well comes out in Helheim. I've heard a couple of people talk about this in the past, and I found it really, really interesting how basically while he doesn't have his eye, while it is in the well, it can see what is going on in Helheim, and it can see that dark, demonic, almost afterlife that exists specifically in that realm. He knows both sides of what is happening, in Asgard, in Midgard, but also now in Helheim. He can see like the dark side of basically everything down there. So the fact that his visions are colored in this bright red color is really interesting to me in that respect. It's almost like he's seeing visions into the future, sure, but it's also like he's seeing that like dark personification of like Helheim, of what's going to happen. It's giving him more information about the future in that way.
Yeah, that's a very interesting way to put it. And yeah, hell is the land of the dead, or at least one of the lands of the dead. It's kind of on the opposite spectrum from where he resides in Asgard. And so far with these visions, at least, they've given him a glimpse towards violent ends, an arrow, at the very least so far. And maybe as we go further, we'll see potentially that, that kind of connection with, this death vision, the visions of the damned. Maybe those visions kind of guide him more further towards people's deaths specifically. We don't know yet. But it's definitely something to kind of very interesting to kind of keep in mind. He's sold. He's being led, however, far away to the next chieftain settlement, whatever. And again, that little primitive trope. You're using the arrowhead. He's basically able to, like, discreetly undo his binds, break free of his chains, murder a dude, take his axe, murder another dude. Within like 6 seconds. And it's that point that I was trying to kind of allude to very discreetly earlier, of these visions that he gets kind of just leading further to violence and leading further towards death. We get that as well in the the dying words of the king, essentially, or of the chieftain there. This man is driven by hate and by death itself, and he has to keep killing, basically. Like, it's the only thing he's able to do. I think it's interesting too because the scene that we just saw with him mounting the head on the spike. First off, that was the head of, I think, the chieftain.
The chieftain, yeah. That owned him.
Yeah, that owned him, that we saw talking. Who I don't think was part of the entourage.
I don't think so. He must have gone back for him.
Well, that was the other thing, is where he planted it was by the fighting pole. So he actually journeyed back to where he was kept captive to kill the chieftain and mount his head on the spear.
Right.
Which is also a little interesting because that whole spear mounting, it's very reminiscent of like a kneading pole. Which is like the insult pole that we know from Egilskaga, when he mounted the horse head and had turned it to face Eric Bloodaxe and his wife, and he cast the curse on them. It was supposed to curse them, for as long as the pole was erected and stuff. So it's almost kind of like him going back and cursing, that man and those people for, binding him and keeping him captive. It's just interesting to kind of see that, like, ritualistic pagan practice that One Eye seems to be well versed in.
Getting that arrowhead is the thing that allowed him to kind of free himself discreetly, but considering the warrior that he is and considering the amount of prowess that he has, you almost get the sense that he could have always freed himself, and he chose to do it right after being sold to another man. It almost goes back to what you were saying earlier, that you have Odin's favor until you don't, until he decides that you don't. And it's almost like he decided that the time was now, that he was no longer going to be a captive.
What was the difference between just picking up a rock and breaking himself free at any point in time that he could have done it, versus, waiting until, the moment where he's kind of guided to it? I think it's kind of, again, reminiscent of the idea of fate guiding a man's path, guiding a man's life, because we know that the Vikings were very fatalistic, or rather, the Norse were very fatalistic. They believed that from the moment they were born, their way of life was decided and their moment of death was predetermined, and there's no way to escape it. He sees these moments of the future, that are defining crucial elements for his own direction, what he's supposed to do. So it could be that he's kind of just acting as he sees fate emerge, or just kind of recognize that he is a subject of fate, whether he's a god or not, because even the gods can't escape their own fate. And so he's waiting for those little prolific moments to kind of show themselves for him to take the next step.
The very first poem of the Poetic Edda is Odin speaking with a seer about the future, and learning everything that happens basically from the inception of the gods all the way to Ragnarok, and even beyond that, who survives and who dies beyond that. And at every step of the way, she's asking him, have you learned enough yet? Do you want to know more, essentially? Shall I stop? So it's him kind of gaining that knowledge, but also, even though he has that knowledge within him throughout all of the mythology and all of the stories and all of the quests that he goes on, he doesn't necessarily, he wants to delay it and he wants to do something about it, but he doesn't necessarily act to just completely rip it apart and stop it. He doesn't stop the Norns from weaving the fates of everyone that's involved. And ultimately he does go to battle and sacrifices himself to battle and dies.
And that's an interesting kind of thing that comes up too. Because it's the whole idea of like, well, if you know how it's going to happen, why don't you stop it? Well, that's not the point. You can't stop it. You just know what's going to happen. So it starts off with One Eye, as we now know him to be called, kind of like seeing the boy follow him, and just kind of like observe him, I guess, almost like question. And, the kid's like, has a mini child heart attack as he's like waiting to be judged, essentially, before it's deemed like, okay, you can follow, I guess. But it's interesting because, we think of One Eye as this murderer because that's all we've seen him as. And yet he did let at least one person go who just ran off when he first broke out, and now he's letting the boy live. And, it might be easy to say, well, of course I'm going to let a boy live. it's a boy, what can he do? And that's a good point. He's the only character that we've seen who hasn't been hostile or kind of superior to One Eye. Even in the earlier scenes, he was the one that the older men kind of entrusted to go into the cage to help, chain One Eye up, and he didn't do anything to the boy. He was the one who brought him the meals and fed him. He was the only person to show him generosity. He's the one who fed him ale.
There you go.
There we go. And that's why I thought it was really interesting when you brought up that story, because, of all the people keeping him captive for these, years at a time, the child here is the only one to actually show him that bit of generosity. And, maybe that was because it was his job, who knows, but he was the one to do it. And because of that, he's the one who's granted a little bit of leniency and mercy, and to the point where he even goes out of his way to protect the boy.
We're God's own soldiers, warrior. Heading for Jerusalem.
We know that historically Jerusalem has always been a very sacred land for multiple religions, not just Christianity, and it's always been fought over. So, so now they're talking about going back to take it back, and they're asking him to join them, a heathen, on their quest. It is kind of interesting that right before he meets them, he has another vision of the sword that the sun carries on the ship, which means that his fate is telling him that he should follow them.
And it's interesting because if we are taking that kind of strain, we know that, he's going to go with them, if for no other reason than because it's what his fate is, and he knows that. And here they are, this preacher essentially with these Christians talking about how it's a way that he should follow them to save his soul, whether he lives or dies, or to kind of expunge his sins, essentially. Trying to kind of like, not goad, but like coerce him to join their cause, to like alleviate this like cloud that exists over him, being this man of hell, and even the Christians were a little bit lighthearted about that, because, the child says, when he's asked, where does he come from? He goes, from hell. And one of the guys is like, oh, where's that? Like, yeah, hell. Oh, yeah, what? I've never heard of that land. Where is it? Where in Scotland is that? On the other side of the ocean. So we'll see. We know, at least in the mythology, that there are these 9 distinct realms. And we see these 9 individual realms as being very individualistic, separated from each other. But in the Norse world, that isn't necessarily true. They're all bound in some kind of relation to each other. They're all kind of connected. It's not like you leave one and then travel on Yggdrasil to the other, and it's just there. They're all kind of connected some way through this extra-dimensional necessity. To get to Asgard, you take the Bifrost, the Rainbow Bridge, that spans between Asgard and Midgard and possibly other realms. Oftentimes when Thor and Loki go out on travels and adventures together. They often cross over giant mountainous regions to get to Jotunheim. And then, like, when Odin makes various trips into Hell, he takes his 8-legged horse and travels down, like, the River the Damned, basically, into Helheim. So these places are all kind of, like, interconnected and exist in the same physical world, but they go to different areas if you're able to find that, like, magical passageway.
The big old tree, Yggdrasil, has its roots in 3 different realms.
Exactly.
So it can also be used for travel.
Yeah, absolutely. And it can even be accessed individually. You know, like Odin hangs himself from Yggdrasil. That's not necessarily in any specific realm. It's just from the tree itself.
Exactly.
So this notion that, you know, he comes from Hell, and, you know, where is Hell? It's on the other side of the ocean. It could be a kind of very similar connection to traveling between the different realms in the Norse mythology, where, you know, the road to Hell for, you know, One Eye to go back home, as the boy's kind of translating for him, is to venture across the sea.
Kind of deviating a little bit from mythology and a little bit more into the practical. I guess we could talk about sea voyages back in the Viking Age. And this isn't exclusive just to the Vikings, but one of the things that we know is when they set out to sea, they didn't set out just to an open sea. What they actually did is they did a lot of land hopping almost. They hugged coasts of the continents, essentially. You know, say like the Faroe Islands would have been founded before Iceland, and Iceland would have been founded before Greenland. And all of those land masses and islands are kind of lined up one after another. And that's because if they did ever lose sight of land, it was for a fairly short amount of time. It's what allowed them to reach North America as quickly as they did, because from Greenland to North America, it's kind of, you know, a hop and a skip and they're here. So they didn't really stray too far away from land. They didn't go into the open ocean a lot. The Vikings that did sail into the open ocean hoping to find new land were basically going on a fool's errand. They didn't know if they were going to find land or if they were just going to die out there.
Yep.
There was nothing for them to base it off if they didn't have the maps that we have nowadays. They didn't know what the entirety of the world looked like.
Yep.
You know, that brings me to the second point. They did have a very rudimentary way of navigating using a sunstone and a dial, and actually the first season of Vikings shows that really well. Using the sunstone, even during overcast days, they'd be able to find the sun, and using the dial that is set in a bucket of water, it could tell them if they were too far south or if they were too far north. So that if they were trying to chart course exactly west, they would know that if they were on course or if they had listed off one side or the other. Which is, you know, the only way that they could have a hope of even sailing straight west, just to see what was literally straight west. A third thing that they would have used is birds. They would have taken birds on their voyages, and every once in a while they would let a bird out of a cage, let it fly off. If the bird comes back, that means there's no land around. If the bird does not come back, that means that there's land that it found, and it landed there and is not coming back.
Yep, and hopefully they can try to see where it went. You know,
Exactly.
It's not like a completely overcast day.
Exactly, yeah. This scene painted a really good picture about what it would have been like were you to just kind of strike out into the open ocean with no land in sight, with nothing to see around you, no way to use a sunstone, no birds to try and test with to see where land is even. You would be in a very bad situation.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why they kind of waited for proper weather before setting sail as well. And I know there's going to be a couple people probably in the comments to say, well, you know, this is why Vikings had oars on their ships as well. And that's absolutely my thought.
But then which way are you rowing?
Exactly. And that's the next thought, which is, you know, this is exactly why you would have oars, so you don't have to rely on just the sails. So you're not stagnating in the water. But the problem is that because it's so overcast, like, not only is it hard to even make out where the sun is, but you also can't tell where you're going anyway. So there's kind of no point. You might be sailing completely the wrong direction. You don't want to risk it. So it's titled Men of God. So it's all about the men of God, these new Christians that their companions are. It's interesting because this is like the first challenge that they encounter on their path to Jerusalem, on their Holy Crusade, essentially, that they're trying to pitch from Scotland or from wherever they are. And like a big hurdle or obstacle that a lot of people go through are these, on these quests of theirs, are these frequent challenges that are supposed to kind of test and try their faith. Whether that's in mythology or in folklore or just even on a personal basis. We all go through those trials every day of our lives, really. And this is a very interesting one because as they're being challenged, you kind of see these men of God, these like high toting people start to devolve. These, men of faith who have this utmost trust in God and are on this important quest, suddenly saying, "Oh, we're being cursed by a boy. Like it must be that pagan child cursing us." And it just kind of shows that kind of like path to degradation that they kind of follow too. That kind of falling back on these old-fashioned or primitive or kind of pagan beliefs of theirs, really. Because at least as far as I know, curses aren't really like a thing in like proper Christianity. I might be wrong, but it's more associated with like heathen or like pagan magic,
Right.
and you're trying to break the curse or something.
Yeah, I think in Christianity, it's more of Christ forsaking you for some reason, or
Yeah.
you did something that is so bad that now you're being punished for it.
Exactly. And that also kind of helps lead into this next point, is why they're being tested in the first place. Any voyage like this, any crusade, you should be tested, I feel like. That's kind of like a trope for going on a crusade. It's
Right.
the whole point of it is to reclaim Holy Land and go on this religious epic quest. So it's natural to feel that you should be tested by your faith and to really see if this is something that's suited for you and that you're devoted to. And that brings to the question is this a test by God? Is he using that same mentality that they had in the Viking Age to use a pagan or use a heathen to test their faith, as they thought the raids were, as we talked about in our episode just a few days ago? Or on the flip side, is this Odin kind of steering these men off and leading them astray and kind of putting them to the test and showing them the falsehoods of their belief, of their faith?
The boy said he was from hell. Maybe that's where we're going.
So we were discussing how a couple of times now it's been called out that One Eye has come from hell. And, the question is, if he is this personification of Odin has not come from hell or Helheim or anything like that. But if you start thinking about it in the way that now we're dealing with Christianity, and how in Christianity, one of the beliefs that they have is that there will be somebody who is a false god, and this false god will try to speak to you and will try to lure you to commit all of these sins, and he will be Satan, and the devil is from hell. So because we're dealing with somebody who is a personification of Odin, but he is not the Christian god, it could be seen that he is that false god. And the fact that they're saying that he is from hell, he's the false god that is from hell, he's not the true Christian god. It could be an allusion to something like that. I could be completely and totally off base here.
No, but that's a really good connection to make too, because it's dealing with all facets of a Nordic kind of pagan religion, as well as those ties between Christianity and how they viewed each other as well. And you're absolutely right. Odin, we know, comes from Asgard and is a Norse deity. But in terms of any kind of Christian's eyes, they don't believe in Asgard. That's not a thing. That's falsehood. That's pagan lies, basically. There is only heaven and there's only hell and there's only earth. So anything that's not heavenly and divine is evil, and it's from hell. So it makes absolute sense that any kind of pagan god in their eyes would be derived or derivative from some kind of basis in hell, which would make Odin some kind of like demonic figure in their eyes. So that's a great point, actually.
Which is kind of how some of these characters are seeing him, as this demonic figure raised from hell, who is this warrior who just kills and has hatred in his heart.
Yeah.
But then when you watch him, you don't really sense that hatred at all.
Absolutely. That's a really good point. I'm gonna I'm gonna like focus on that as we go through further. That's really cool.
Do you think the boy could be the cause of this?
Of course.
So with that idea that, you know, they're saying that One Eye comes from hell and he's like this weird, like, evil creature just devoted to killing, they're blaming the child for being stranded. They're blaming him for the curse, right? So it's like, why would they blame the child when they're dealing with a man from hell, supposedly? Mm-hmm. He's kind of his guide, his companion of One Eye, but he's very innocent in that nature. You know, he doesn't know who Christ is. He's like kind of on the border and kind of that, like, you know, being pulled both ways, trying to, you know, be converted and being kept to his, what we assume is his faith, you know, being a heathen.
Maybe it was some kind of a superstitious thing, but I can't really see a reason for them to suspect a child that is, you know, speaking for him. As far as the representation of the child, the only thing that's really coming to my mind right now is actually Mimir himself. Because in Norse mythology, Mimir is basically beheaded, and Odin gathers his head and reanimates it, and he speaks to him, essentially.
All the time.
Yeah, to gain his counsel and to gain his thoughts on what's happening and everything like that. It's not necessarily what's happening here. It's not like One Eye is looking to the child to, you know, tell him his thoughts on everything. But just from the fact that One Eye does not talk, the child talks for him, it's kind of like he is lending his thoughts to him in a way.
That's a great point, actually. Like there are these little instances that we see of, you know, these shared moments of theirs that are completely silent and almost like kind of cast over, but they kind of do hold some kind of counsel. You know, completely unspoken and at times not even like looking at each other, but like exactly that moment where he was speaking for them when they were back on land, and One Eye's kind of like off to the side, just kind of not even paying attention and just kind of staring off. But like he had those like mannerisms as if he was speaking, you know, he's playing with things and kind of like looking off and like glancing around, but then the boy was there almost like channeling him and kind of speaking the words for him. So it is kind of like they do share a mind or share some kind of counsel between them. That's very interesting to make that connection with Mimir too. I like that. I like that a lot.
So we're about halfway through the movie. So we're actually going to pause here and we'll finish up the rest next Sunday. So if you have not watched this movie yet, and now after seeing this discussion you actually want to watch it, go do that before next Sunday, and we will finish the discussion then.
I'm really curious to know what everybody else thinks about the movie too. So like, we've talked about so much already. Like, let us know in the comments how you're feeling about this. If you've watched the movie already, let us know some thoughts that you have coming up. Keep it centered around just what we've discussed so far. We don't want to spoil anything for the next time. What do you think the boy represents? What is this journey? What is the pilgrimage? Anything. Absolutely anything. You know, these hallucinations or the visions, the premonitions that he has. Anything you want to discuss, let us know, because it's going to be awesome, and there's so much to extrapolate on. It's really cool.
Thank you guys so much for watching. We hope you enjoyed it. If you did, hit the like button. If you're new to the channel, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you can be notified of our future videos, and we'll see you in the next one.